Welcome to Your College Bound Kid,
a podcast for parents, college counselors, students, and anyone who wants a weekly deep dive into the world of college admissions.
My name is Dave. I'm a parent of a daughter in college, and we live in Chicago, Illinois.
I'm Lisa, and I'm a clinical psychologist and college counselor. I have a daughter in college, a daughter in high school, and a son in middle school. After 30 years in Chicago, we recently moved to North Carolina.
My name is Mark. I'm a college coach in Atlanta and the parent of two daughters. Karis, a graduate of Davidson College, and she is the founder of the Spanish tutoring company, SpanishHelpToday.com. And Joy is a graduate of the University of Georgia, and she is getting her master's degree at North Carolina State University. Good morning, friends. I have a very exciting episode. I think you guys are going to like a lot. As you know, I'm doing reflections on this admissions year now that all the decisions have been made. I mean, students haven't made their decisions yet. You have until May 1st to do that. And in some cases, you can get extensions. I'm talking about colleges have released all their decisions. And so just looking back, looking at the data, also factoring a little bit of data over the last couple of years. And when I say data, I'm honestly talking about my experience. So this is subjective. It's personal. It's us looking at all the decisions that we've seen from this admission season, factoring in really the last 3 years, because things got a lot more selective since schools went test optional, especially at the more selective schools, which is the ones everybody's interested in. We try to talk about other schools, but that's where the interest tends to lie. And I understand that. People are aspirational. They have high goals, and I understand that. And so what I'm sharing with you, though, it's not just me looking at a list of which schools have the lowest acceptance rates. I've looked at those. A lot of those schools are on the ones I want to share with you, but a lot are not because schools manipulate, and not all schools. I'll say it's not uncommon for schools to manipulate their acceptance rates. I'm also not just looking at lists of these are the hardest 50, 75, 100 schools to get into. I've seen those lists and I actually have looked at them. I agree with some of those decisions. I disagree with others from my experience. So this is just my experience. And I'm sharing it with you partly because of an experience I had with a family last week. And so a very, very strong applicant. Had a meeting with the family. Student actually got into an Ivy League school in regular admission. So, they have to be strong to do that. But they didn't get into their top choice ED, and they didn't get into a couple of their other top choices as well. And in having a conversation with the family, the mom said, Mark, I knew the top schools were really going to be tough. I'm just surprised how hard that next tier is to get into. And I thought, you know what? That's where a lot of people are. And so the reason why I'm sharing this with you is so that when you're building your list, you don't feel like a tsunami hit you when decisions are released, and that you're really surprised at schools that you thought your child would be admitted at, they're either waitlist or denied. One of the downsides of the test optional movement, when tests were required, they would serve somewhat as a red light or at least a yellow light for a non-competitive applicant. Because as you probably heard me often say, test scores will knock you out, but they won't necessarily get you in, especially at highly selective schools. But when somebody got like an 11, 20 on an SAT or 23 on an ACT, they would say, you know what, I probably don't need to be applying to name your school, Stanford or whatever, put your school in there, Rice. I probably don't need to do that. Where now people would say, wow, gee, I get a free pass. They don't see my test scores. Not realizing that test scores are often collinear with transcript and grades. So most of the time, the person with the lower scores also doesn't have the rigor or the high grades in that rigor. So it can lead to some less competitive applicants taking shots at highly selective schools, which is one of the reasons that these schools have seen their admit rates drop precipitously in the last 3 years. It's also a reason why Yale literally changed its file reading process to screen out these non-competitive applicants that were taking up a lot of file reading time. And they put in process a place where that non-competitive applicant can be denied without taking up as much of the reader time as they previously were using. So today, that's what we're going to look at. I'm going to share my research with you of the 75 most difficult schools in the country to get into. And we'll continue our interview with Julia Shields-Rutyna and Jonathan Hughes from MEFA, part 2 of 3. And that's it for today. So let's dive in with the first part, which is this list of the 75 most competitive schools. And someone might think 75, geesh. Are you telling me 75 really hard to get in schools? Well, look at it this way. That's 3%. The top 3% of the hardest schools to get into are going to be really hard. They just are. And so what I've done is I've divided this group up into 2 groups. They're what I'm referring to as Ivies and Ivy peers. Now, this group, believe it or not, and hope this isn't too confusing, this group is not necessarily the hardest 35. I have 35 schools in this group and then 40 in the second group. These are not necessarily the 35 hardest schools in the country to get into. Most of them are, but they're perceived as the 35 hardest schools in the country to get into. And my point is there are a lot of people that think, okay, that school's definitely a reach, but I want to take a shot at it. And a lot of times you should take a shot at it. Just depends how strong you are as an applicant. I am certainly not saying people should not apply to these schools. In fact, for some people, most of your list should be comprised of these schools. I would say not all of your list, but most of your list. It just depends on the strength of the applicant. But the first 35, I feel, have the perception of being really difficult to get into. It's that next 40 that shock people. They think, well, I'm not going to put all my schools in this first 35 bucket. I'm going to put a whole bunch of them in that second bucket of 40 schools. And then when they don't get in there, that's when they're flummoxed. So that's how I'm breaking it down. So the first 35. So who does it include? Well, I'm calling it Ivies and Ivy overlaps. So what I mean by overlaps, students that apply to Ivies often also applies to these schools. You know, the Ivy League is a football conference founded in the mid-40s with schools in the Mid-Atlantic and the Northeast. And so it's those 8 schools, Penn in Pennsylvania, Princeton in New Jersey, Columbia in New York City, Cornell in New York State, Yale in New Haven, Harvard in Cambridge, Boston, Brown in Providence, Rhode Island, Dartmouth in New Hampshire. So yeah, those are your Ivies, but then there's a bunch of Ivy peers, common overlap. So let me break it down geographically. The Ivy peers in the South that people know are really, really selective, I would argue, are Duke in Durham, North Carolina, Vanderbilt in Nashville, Tennessee, and Rice in Houston. Okay, in the Midwest, University of Chicago in Chicago, Northwestern in Evanston, WashU in St. Louis, and Notre Dame in South Bend, Indiana. In the Mid-Atlantic, Johns Hopkins and Georgetown and Juilliard in New York. And in the West, Stanford and Caltech. And then also certain powerhouse smaller liberal arts colleges, sometimes called Little Ivies, Amherst and Williams in New England, Pomona in Claremont, California, and Swarthmore and Swarthmore, PA, just outside of Philly. These are all in that 35 that are perceived as this really, really difficult to get into. And then there's others here. And if you heard our last episode, we're going over people and students that are often disillusioned. We talked about how competitive out-of-state public flagships are for certain in-demand public schools where the population in the state has pushed back against the government and said, listen, we're paying all this taxpayer money, and we can't get in our own flagship schools. So then the Board of Regents has created caps on the number of out-of-state students. And so I would include those schools, 7 in particular, that have out-of-state admit rates in the teens or single digits. And here I'm talking about the University of Michigan, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, University of Virginia, Georgia Tech, UCLA, University of California, Berkeley, and Texas, Austin. So those seven schools, if people know about the restrictions on out-of-state students, are oftentimes people know belong in that group. And then the last four in this tier are the service academies. There's oftentimes a perception that the service academies are really, really selective, and people are aware of the fact that if they're applying to a service academy, they know they're applying to a really highly selective, hard to get in school. So we're talking about West Point, we're talking about the Naval Academy in Annapolis, we're talking about the Air Force in Colorado Springs and the Coast Guard in New London, Connecticut. So that list of 35 schools, oftentimes people are not surprised about how competitive they are. This is a group of schools where, I like to put it this way, most of the schools in that group deny more valedictorians than they admit. This is a group of schools where if you have all A's and A minuses, 35 ACT, 36 ACT, mid 1500 or higher SATs, and you are looking at these schools, especially in regular decision, they are our reach for all. That's what we call their reach for alls. And so, but there's oftentimes a perception for that 35. It's this other 40 that can throw people off. And that's the group that I want to go over with now and share with you. Here we go. This is that 45. Then I'm going to do it geographically. I'm not going to break it down like I did before. I have liberal arts and I have national universities and service academies. I'm just going to go by region. So who's in this group? Well, in New England, there's 10 schools. This is my experience, my research, decisions I've seen this year and the last 2 years. And by the way, I listed them honestly in the order that they popped into my brain when I was looking at research. It's not like the first is harder than the last. They're all grouped together. They're not alphabetical. They're just the order they came into my head when I was doing this. So Bowdoin, Colby, Tufts, Northeastern, Boston College, Boston University, Bates, Middlebury, Wesleyan, and Wellesley. My experience, that group of 10 in New England are a really tough admit, even for really, really strong students, especially in regular admission, and especially if you're unhooked. All right, in the West Coast, I've got 8 schools in the West: Claremont McKenna, Harvey Mudd, and I'll come back and say something about those two in a second. USC, Pitzer, another part of the Claremont colleges, Cal Arts, UC San Diego, UC Irvine, UC Santa Barbara. Okay. And then in the South, Davidson, Wake Forest, the University of Richmond, College of William and Mary, Emory, Washington and Lee, and then for out-of-state applicants, the University of Georgia and the University of Florida. And then finally, Tulane, the last one in that group. And in the Mid-Atlantic, we got another group of 9. We've got Barnard, Haverford, Carnegie Mellon, Hamilton, NYU, Cooper Union, Vassar, Colgate, and Villanova. In the Midwest, 3, Grinnell, Case Western Reserve, and Carleton. And in the Mountain West, Colorado College. So these 75 schools, to me, are the hardest to get into. They're the 3% of the most difficult schools to get into. Now, was it a clear 75 and a huge drop-off after that? No. I would say some schools that, just looking at decisions I've seen, were really on the cusp. And that would include schools like Smith, Scripps, and Wisconsin as well for out-of-state students. Now, I didn't even get into, I don't want to use the term niche, but I guess I just used niche, so I used it, right? There are always certain majors at certain schools that are ridiculous. Like if you're looking at the performing arts, a lot of times, let's say you have a dancer, programs like Oklahoma and TCU and IU and Utah and Butler, those are all really tough for a place for something like ballet. But I didn't get into like niche majors for schools. But it's important that you know that if that's your area of interest. So I said I'd come back to a few schools like CMC and Harvey Mudd. Some in the second group are harder to get into than the first group. But the public doesn't necessarily know that. So I that's why I created the two groups. The second group is the tricky one. It's the one I really want to emphasize because it's the one that I'm finding is tripping people up. And the whole purpose of this is not to be negative. The point is to get ahead of the curve. So as certain schools get harder and harder to get into, word gets out about that, and then people start applying to the next group, and then that group gets harder and harder to get to. But if you're behind the wave, then you can experience the same thing, which is deny, waitlist, deny, waitlist, or in early round defer. And I'm trying to get you ahead of the curve. As I said, these are the 3% of the hardest schools to get into, and there's lots of amazing other schools in that 97%. So I don't care who you are, all your list should not be comprised of just schools in that 3% or that 75. And so hopefully this was helpful. The purpose of it is to help you with your list building. If you're a junior or a sophomore or a parent of a junior, sophomore, or freshman, to recognize how hard that second group has gotten to get in. There's so many schools in that second group that I'm just completely gobsmacked when I see how hard they are to get in now compared to 3-4 years ago. I mean, places like Villanova, I cannot believe how much harder Villanova is to get into than when I was working with Susan in Pennsylvania. About 20 miles from Villanova at the time, maybe less. Obviously, we've talked about Northeastern, but there's so many other schools. Pitzer, I mean, it's just completely different how much harder it is to get into than it once was. Grinnell, I cannot believe how hard that school is to get into compared to how it once was. And I could go on and on and on. Tulane is another one. And, in Tulane, and, some schools, I didn't get into this in this conversation. Some schools go to such great lengths through their predictive modeling to figure out who they think is coming that it does impact this. But there are a lot of schools that do that. The bottom line is it's hard to get in. And so I'm not going to list all Tufts. Tufts is so much harder to get into than Boston College. Oh, my goodness. In fact, I had to literally reach out to a family mid-year, very, very strong student I was working with. And I had listed Boston College as a probable or likely on their list. And I had to call him and say, that is not a probable or likely, not in regular admission where they admit less than 1 in 7. And so I apologize for that. That should be more of a target or a mid-range school. I just had misread the selectivity and how much difference had occurred, partly with all the stuff I've talked about, test optional, COVID, people fleeing to safety. But also remember, that's a school that introduced early decision 3 years ago and 2 rounds of it. And so obviously with early decision, smaller numbers of people gobble up large chunks of spots, and then the masses come in and you're fighting for less spots. So that's really changed Boston College's selectivity. So as I said, hopefully this was helpful. Hopefully this will help you with your list building. Hopefully also if you're a senior and you never got into one of these 75 schools and maybe you didn't realize how hard they were to get into, maybe now in hearing this, maybe you won't feel so bad. Just know that this list of 75 has broken a lot of hearts at the altar. Okay, lots of waitlist defers and denials. And so maybe there's comfort in knowing that you're not alone if you've already gone through the process as a senior or a parent of a senior listening. And if you're younger, please take this into consideration. If you're building a list on your own without the help of a professional, please take into consideration how selective this group of 75 has become, especially in regular decision.
And now this week's interview with a special guest.
Okay, friends, hopefully you enjoyed the first part of my interview with Julia Shields-Rutyna and Jonathan Hughes from MEFA. And now it is time for part 2. And in part 2, Jonathan will talk about the important conversations students and parents need to have about paying for college and funding college. Julia talks about when do you appeal and how do you appeal for more money. Julia also talks about how do you appeal? What are the do's and don'ts of appealing? Jonathan talks about how families can know what loans to borrow. And Julia and Jonathan answer the question, how much loan debt should a student take on? Listen and enjoy. So let's talk about what if someone doesn't get enough money, and is there an appeals process? And I'll let the two of you decide sort of who wants to answer that question.
I'll start off and then you can talk about appeals, Julie. How about that?
Okay.
Okay. So, yeah. So one of the things, even before, and I have this bad habit, and I'm going to indulge it here of answering sort of before the question. One of the worst things that I see on a regular basis is that somebody has applied to one college and they have a financial aid offer from that college and they can't afford to go there. So one of the ways that you can help yourself out the best here is to have a range of colleges that you apply to. And in admissions, you're sort of familiar with saying, okay, you should have likely schools that you're likely to be admitted to, target schools, and then reach schools. And you should have a similar range in terms of cost as well. So you're not stuck in that situation where the only colleges that you've applied to or that you're accepted to are ones that are outside of your price range. So give yourself some options there. You may have to, maybe choose a second choice or a third choice, depending on what happens with the financial aid office. You could choose a more affordable path. We talked about rolling admissions before, similar in a way, open enrollment. So we always like to talk about the public or the community college route. If you are in a position where you are only accepted to the colleges that you maybe it's going to be a stretch to be able to afford them, you have that option of applying to a community college to begin. And then you can maybe go there for a year or two and to transfer into your first choice later on, bolster your grades and to do that. So that's always a good option. It's another chance to have that type of kitchen table conversation. We just talked about communication between students and parents in terms of, signing up for health insurance and things like that. But there are other conversations that might be difficult to have that need to be had sometimes. And it's about price, right? And it's about what can reasonably be afforded. And so I have a colleague who, he's told me that his parent would not pay for the school that he really wanted that was his top choice school. And, he was really upset about it, but it ended up being the best thing for him. So it's not where you it's not where you start, it's where you finish, right? So you can start in a less expensive school, maybe a community college, transfer in. And then also, you got your financial aid offer from the college. That's their offer. And most colleges will tell you that they go into their, they go out with their best offer first. But that's not necessarily the end of the conversation, right? So if there are things that the college needs to know that they didn't get maybe from the financial aid forms that you filed, you can always follow up with them. And I'm smiling because it's like a running joke on my show. I always advise people on our show. I always advise people to reach out to the financial aid office with any special circumstances, and you can appeal. And I'll let Julie talk about appeals then.
Yeah, I'd love Julie. I'd love for you to, and I'm trying so hard to call you Julia. It's one of our co-hosts is Julia.
Oh.
So I have to discipline myself because I'm used to talking. So I'm Julie. I'd love for you to talk about when and how. When do you appeal and how do you appeal? Because I know it can be very complicated.
Yeah, that's good. So I would say that as soon as you receive the financial aid offers actually, because it's good if you can then compare and go through the process that Jonathan just described. And let's say you have your first choice college, and even though you're looking at your other options at the same time, thinking, okay, if I can't go there, but I really want to go to this college, then that's the point where you should feel free to appeal. Now, what I would say is that the easy things to appeal about are significant changes in your financial situation since you applied. So sometimes you've applied in the fall and now this is April we're talking about, and things might have changed. So if there's anything that's a job loss, a new family member moved in and now you're supporting that family member, there were some medical bills, anything that's a very specific, concrete financial change, that you should send to the college immediately. And in fact, I've had families call me with fairly tragic situations and then ask, is this something I should tell the financial aid office? And I always say, oh my goodness, of course, absolutely. Sometimes people are afraid to pour all that out. But absolutely anything like that, you should share with the financial aid office. And the more concrete it is, the financial aid office has a lot to work with and can hopefully make some adjustments. But let's say there really isn't too much different. A family can still think about, wow, what did we not share about our situation on those financial aid forms? You know, the FAFSA doesn't have much room to write any special circumstances. So are there things that we weren't able to put there? Let's write about those just to share as much information as possible. And then it might come down to, this is the student's first choice college. We have a big gap. We calculated everything. We have a large gap. We received more money from other colleges. Is there anything that you can do to help us? We're willing to work more, work over the summers, but an amount of $4,000 to $5,000 in addition would really make this doable. And so I think the more concrete that the family can show, we have a plan, we've worked it all out, but we need just a little more. Now, if the family needs $20,000 more, that probably won't happen. But if the family if a couple of extra $1,000 would make a difference, then it may be possible for the college to make some adjustments with that type of information. So I guess I would say to a family, always speak up, always appeal, but also be realistic and manage your expectations in that you could appeal at one college and they might be able to help you. If you happen to appeal at another, they might say, I'm sorry, we went out with our best financial aid offers and there's nothing we can do. So at least they can manage those expectations.
I'm really glad you presented it that way, because there are schools that lead with their best offer and they just flatly turn people down right away. And then there's others that don't. And I'm also find as well that if people ask for something that's just completely outrageous, they might just say no, where if they asked for 5,000 or less, they might possibly work with you.
Yes.
And even if they don't give you that, they might counter with halfway or something, where if they think you're completely asking something outlandish, then they won't even attempt to do something. Now, you brought up something interesting. So, you talked about how the easiest appeal to win is one where there's you can demonstrate a need, like job loss or, downsizing, or sometimes significant health expenses, medical expenses, things like that. Do you feel that also applies to schools that don't meet financial need than gap? Or were you referring more to schools that meet full financial need?
Well, it can be both. So again, it's funny that you say it that way because that's true. Those colleges that do promise to meet full financial need, they tend to be the colleges with maybe larger resources, may have some extra money to be able to use to address appeals. So in that way, your question is a good one because those schools might have an easier time responding to an appeal like that. But even other colleges who don't promise to meet full financial need, if a student appeals with a very concrete financial change, they may still have some money to be able to address that.
And the one thing that I would add is that if somebody is either going to receive a Pell Grant or they're close to receiving a Pell Grant, and then your need-based appeal puts you into that Pell Grant range, that can be the easiest appeal to win because the school's not tapping into their own money. And the Department of Education trusts the financial aid officers to use their professional judgment. And so, now if you're into Pell Grant money, they're actually not giving away their own money. It's the government's money. And so that's been the easiest appeal to win. Now, what about competitor appeals? What is your advice on that? Because there are schools that actually encourage competitor appeals. And maybe you can explain competitor appeals. And then there's some that just, don't. And then there's some that might respond for some schools, but not other schools. So why don't you talk a little bit about competitor appeals, Julie?
Yeah. So, and I'll define it a little bit. So a competitor appeal is contacting a college and picking another college that they know is a strong competitor of that college and saying that college gave me 5,000 more than you, knowing that those two colleges are in competition. And I would say that it depends on the college. Colleges may think different ways about that. So the way I try to say it, I try to tell people maybe don't do exactly that because you don't know how that's going to go. And another thing you shouldn't do is you should never go in and say, can I negotiate my financial aid award?
That's a terrible word.
Yeah.
I hear it all the time too.
Right. And financial aid administrators do take their jobs very seriously. They put a lot of effort into creating these awards. And then that just, it could definitely rub people the wrong way.
They don't want to feel like used car salespeople.
Yeah. Yes. So don't do that. So the way I like to say it is to have a really honest conversation. Here's the other piece. I've seen sometimes families, contacting multiple colleges to just try to, I'll call it wheel and deal to see but that can backfire as well. So I would say have an honest conversation. Pick the college you really want to go to and have an honest conversation of this is, and then pour out the information, which may include the fact that you received a better award from a competitive institution, but it's part of it. It's the nursing program here. I've talked to the students. It's exactly what I want. This is where their internships are. And, I've worked it all out, but we are really short $3,000, whereas these other programs have given more. So you're giving that competitive information, but as part of that honest conversation of, I'm going to lay it all out for you. And please, I want to appeal for this.
All right. 2 follow-up questions on this where I've heard different things from different financial aid offices. Some say they like to, if you're talking about a competitor, they like to see it in writing. Send over that other aid award in writing. And then some don't care about that. And then the second question is, I've heard different opinions on who should be doing this. So I've had some financial aid offers say, I like to hear from the student. One, it pulls on my heartstrings because I want to help the student. Secondly, I know that it lets me know that the student really wants to come, especially if they're saying this is my first choice. I really want to come. I've talked with my family. We're a little short. And then I've heard other people say, well, we understand when it comes to finances, that's really the parents' purview. That's kind of in their wheelhouse. They're the ones probably paying the bill and all of this. So we understand it. Maybe it's better talking to the knowledgeable person on when it comes to money. So what is your advice on student or parent? Yeah. And I didn't even remember my first question. That's what's bad when you do 2 questions at once. Maybe I remember it. Good.
So you asked about should they send the competitive award to share that. So I would say along the lines of not knowing exactly what the college will want, when you make the appeal and you say you received more money from another college, then you could just say, I'd be happy to send along that offer. And then if the college wants it and wants to see it, because it's true, sometimes they do want to, they can say, yes, please send that along. And then if they don't, maybe they're not going to pay attention to that part of the appeal. So I would say, again, have that honest conversation, put it all out there, and then see how the college responds on that one. And then as far as parent or student, I've heard similar things to you, Mark. I would say you can never go wrong having the student contact the college and pull this all together. I mean, any time a student reaches out, that's looked upon favorably by the college. However, I also have heard from many, many financial aid offices that they completely understand that many times parents are paying the bill. And so if that is the case and the award appeal does come from the parent, that is, it's fine. It's okay. So, yeah.
So the way I've been advising my families is have the student reach out to see if they can set up a meeting or a conversation, whether it's in person or a Zoom call if possible, and then say that my mom would like to attend or whatever, and so that's kind of how I've been approaching that. And the first question, I find that most colleges do like to get that other award. And I don't know if it's because they're going to match or if they're just curious what their competitors are doing, but they like to see that other one. So usually that's, most of the time they kind of like that. So good stuff. Yeah. Awesome. I know that was lots of stuff on appealing, but I think that's an important topic that families have a lot of questions about. So, Jonathan, how do families know what loans to borrow? There's different loans out there. We haven't even touched on private loans yet.
Right, I know. And, by the time we get to loans, I was saying to Julie, this is like, you're almost at the end of this really long process. We think of applying to colleges, applying to financial aid, making your college decision, trying to figure out how you're going to pay and what you can afford to pay out of pocket, and then what you're going to borrow for. You're almost at the end here. I think, again, I'll indulge my bad habit of answering, starting before the question and saying anything that you can pay out of pocket, you should. One of the things that we always like to talk about whenever we talk about borrowing is being a wise borrower. And, the fact is that most families, most students, they're going to have to borrow something to get through 2 or 4 or more years of college. And that in and of itself is not necessarily a problem, of course. So the problem is, you borrow too much or you borrow more than you absolutely need to borrow. So take a look at what you have. Once you get your financial aid done, there's basically 3 ways that you can use to pay. Past income, meaning any savings that you have. Present income, your income. Check into a monthly payment plan if colleges offer that. Most of them do. Pay what you can out of pocket, because once you exhaust everything, the only thing that's left is your future income, meaning borrowing loans. And so the first thing you have to remember is we talk a lot about student loans, right? It's in the news all the time, student loans, student loans. So people think, even right up to the end of this process, that students can really just borrow whatever it is that they need to borrow in their own name only, and as long as they promise to pay it back after college. But that's not really the case. Really, the only loans that most students are going to be able to get on their own are those federal student loans. And there are loan limits associated with that. So that's $5,500, for their freshman year. And so if you have a freshman year financial aid offer there, that $5,500 figure should be familiar to you. And that is the student's sole responsibility, and that's already part of the financial aid offer. So if you've got a balance after that, most students are going to need a loan where somebody on the loan has to be credit approved or approved on the basis of credit and income. And most students just are not going to be able to meet that requirement. So it's going to have to be a parent or somebody else as a co-applicant. And so what you have to understand about being a co-applicant is that you are equally responsible to repay that with the student. I've heard it many, many times over the years at MEFA, parents saying, I know I'm the co-applicant. It's not really my loan, though. It's really his loan or it's really her loan. But that's your loan. It's on your credit report. You're responsible, just like the student. So you're going to want to make a really careful choice in terms of your private loans. And so I think what you want to do in this case, there are 2 main types of loan. One we touched on already, which is the PLUS, the parent loan for undergraduate student, that federal loan that sometimes, unfortunately, gets packaged in with the rest of the financial aid. As Julie pointed out, it's not financial aid. You have to apply and be approved for that loan, and it's a credit loan as well. The biggest difference between that loan and other types of loans, number one, it's a federal loan, so it is from the federal government. And number 2, the parent is solely responsible for that loan. So remember, I said the parent is always at least a co-applicant. In the case of a PLUS, they're the only applicant. So it's only the parent on that loan. The student's not responsible to repay that. Some people like that. Some people don't. I would say most parents probably aren't thrilled with that. But that's an option. It's a fine loan to have. It's a PLUS loan. And you can apply for whatever it is that you need to pay the rest of the balance. And then there's everything else, which are private loans. And when I say private loans, I mean not from the government. So that includes the MEFA loan, our loan. It includes things like Navient. It includes things like loans from Citizens Bank or Wells Fargo. There's no shortage of private educational loans that you can apply for. So it can get kind of overwhelming. How do you know which ones are the best ones to take? And so what I would say is figure out what are the most important factors for you. Now, there are certain factors that you can use to judge loans against one another. The first and most obvious being interest rate, right? So low interest rate is better, fixed or variable interest rate. Some are fixed, some are variable. If it's a fixed interest rate, that interest rate's not going to change. A variable rate may fluctuate. Who's responsible to repay the loan? Is it the student? Is it the parent? Is it both? Is the loan able to be deferred? So do you have to start the repayment while the student is in college? Can you wait until 6 months after the student graduates or leaves? Is there an option for a co-borrower to be released from a loan? So some loans have that option where if you're a parent co-borrower, after a certain amount of on-time monthly payments, you can be released from the loan and the student can take it on his or her own. So once you know the answers to these questions, you can start to know what loans you want to look for. And so how you find those loans, a lot of colleges will have lender lists. And that is, just lists that of lenders that they have worked with before that students have used to pay for college before at that institution. There may also be some other websites. I'm thinking about one. I know it because MEFA's on it. It's called Credible. And basically, you put in an application. It's a soft credit pull, which means it doesn't affect your credit score. And they get back to you with all their lenders that take part in that program and what your answer would be, whether you'd be approved with that lender and what interest rate you'd be approved for. Because, like a lot of most, in fact, that I know of family educational loans, your interest rate is going to depend on your credit score. So the higher your credit score, the lower the interest that you're going to pay is, and vice versa. So those are some good ways to sort of be able to tell private loans apart. We also do a webinar in the summer on comparing college loans. So we're going to go over some of those same topics in depth. And one other thing I'd like to mention too, because I don't think we've mentioned it yet, you can go to a lender website and do a monthly payment calculator. I know on MEFA you can go and say, this is how much I want to borrow, and it sort of estimate your credit and say, how much would this be every month to pay back? And we would have all of our different loan options and how much your monthly payment is. And so when you're thinking about that, this can be a good thing to do before you make your decision. If you know how much it is you need to borrow, this is going to be your monthly payment for 1 year. Think about a total of 4 years of enrollment if your student is going to be going for 4 years. So multiply that by 4 to get some kind of idea of what your monthly payment is going to be on these loans. And know that these loans are going to have 10 or 15-year repayment terms. And so have that sort of gut check moment of, is this something that I can afford, and make a plan to pay.
So what would you say to counselors? There's a school of thought out there that says people shouldn't take private loans because the Parent Plus loan, even that we already said all the things we don't like about it. We didn't even mention high origination fee, which it has, but there are still some federal protections there, right? Like
yes,
forbearance, deferment, income-based repayment.
Yep.
And while it wasn't in the Biden plan for loan forgiveness, there's always the possibility, I guess, because it's federal, that something like that could happen. So what do you say to the person that says, even that I don't like the Parent Plus loan, there's some federal protections that tend to be there that aren't in private loans?
Yeah, well, let me first be clear and say I'm not attempting to throw any shade on the Parent Plus loan at all. And as I say, it's a fine loan to have. And in general, we just always say, do your due diligence, do what's going to be best for you. But if you find a loan that fits you better, then by all means, go for it. If people can get through with just taking their federal direct student loans, that's the best, of course. If they don't have to borrow at all, or if they just take those federal student loans, great. If they want to go for a plus loan, they can go for a plus loan. Just the important thing is to be aware. So what's more important to you? Is it the possibility of some of those federal protections? Is it the possibility of maybe some forgiveness option down the road? Or is it something that, you like maybe the interest rate is lower on another loan, or maybe you have a plan to pay a certain amount and refinance where, you really can't do that with a federal plus loan. You can consolidate, but it's not exactly the same thing. All of these things should be taken into account together, and people should go with sort of the best route that they think is good for them.
And how do you answer the question, what's the maximum amount to borrow? That's a common question that people have. What's sort of the MEFA's advice when it comes to that?
It's a good question, and it's hard to have a hard and fast rule for this. I mean, I was just talking with a family the other day, going over their financial aid offer from their college with them, and they said, "Is this the typical financial aid offer? Is this what most people get?" And I said, "Well, no, it's not what most people get, but then it doesn't really matter what most people get. It matters what you can live with, and what is going to be acceptable for you." So, I've heard different rules of thumb out there of, you shouldn't be borrowing more than, I think, 25% of your yearly salary, what have you. But it's really hard to know. I think the idea is to get the best idea of what it is you're going to be repaying on a monthly basis under control. And the best way that you can do that is to sort of figure out what your 1 year payment on a loan would be, multiply that by 4 or 4.5 even, and try to figure that out. And is that something that you can reasonably manage? Do everything before getting to borrowing, but once you do get there, your finances. Is this something that you can handle? There's no real set figure that I would say you shouldn't be borrowing X, more than X amount of dollars, or you shouldn't be borrowing more than a percentage. I know that there are some people out there that do say that. I really think that each case is its own. But I'm wondering if Julie would have.
Yeah. Julie has some thoughts.
I feel like I think of it almost as a series of questions, right? That the student and parent could sit together and decide, first of all, whose loan is this if we're both on it? Who do we expect is going to pay this off? I think that's a really good conversation to have up front. And then from the parent perspective, the questions might be, how many other children do I have that I hope to support over the next coming years? And then from the student side, it might be, do I plan to go to graduate school? Do I want to be a school counselor, which means I'm going to need to get a master's degree after. So I want to factor that in. Or am I going to become an engineer, and I've been accepted to this college who has statistics saying that all the students that graduate from the engineering program, start with a salary of $85,000 and has real statistics about that or something. And that student might say, well, I know anything can happen, but I know I'm a hard worker and I have these statistics. I'm willing to take on a little extra debt, and that's going to get me there, versus the common scenario of, I really don't know exactly what my job is going to be when I graduate. And maybe that student would be willing to take on a little less. So I think really having both student and parent think through all of those questions does then what John said about making it an individual decision.
I love that answer because it's comprehensive, because it's a completely different situation if someone's going to med school or, professional school versus someone's not, or this is the first of 4 kids and the family is looking at. Those are apples and oranges. It's also apples and oranges if you're going to come up, make 90,000 versus 40,000. So I think that comprehensive approach, and I love your idea of, being upfront with who's paying what back. So I love that approach. Friends, that concludes the second part of my interview with Julia Shields-Rutyna and Jonathan Hughes from MEFA. We have one more part, and it's a shorter interview in the third part. And we'll ask a couple important questions, and then we learn a lot from them on the hot seat too. So I hope you'll come back from that. On Thursday's episode, Julia is my co-pilot, and we'll be looking at an article entitled "The Cynical Reason College Applications Are Surging." It's in the Chronicle for Higher Educationists by Jeffrey Salingo. We'll conclude the final part 5 of 5 of my series I'm doing with Lisa on groups of students who are often disillusioned with the results they get from the college admission process. And we'll be continuing on with our interview with Andre Phillips. And the final part of my interview with Andre on the University of Wisconsin, so we can understand that important flagship. And our college spotlight will be part 2 of 2. I'll be joined by Linda Depker talking about Harvey Mudd College in Claremont, California. And friends, in this season where you're making decisions, don't be influenced by those around you. Don't be influenced by your peers. Don't be influenced even by Uncle Joe and Aunt Jane. You're the one that's going. You're the one who will experience the benefits or the challenges of the school that you pick. So don't forget that college is not a prize to be won. It is a match to be made. See you on Thursday, friends. And that's our show. A big thank you to you, our listeners, for tuning in this week. If you find this podcast helpful, please follow us and you'll get every single episode as soon as it is released. If you're interested, there are a few ways you can really support our podcast. You can click the share button and send it to your friends and acquaintances. You can help us pay our staff and our expenses by donating on our website. You can write a review for us on Apple or Spotify. I'm the producer of the podcast, but we have a fantastic team of 15. Shout out to our co-host, Dr. Lisa Ruff, Dr. David Williams, Linda Depker, Susan Tree, Vince Garcia, and Julia Esquivel. And to our substitute co-host, Sylvia Borgo. Our sensational sound engineer is Nemanja Motvich. Our amazing music is from Victor Allen Weeks. Marketing designs are from Kimberly Blass. Lily Parikh manages our Instagram. Our image editor is Talha Khan. Joy Stucker does our website episode updates. And our webmaster is Stalianos Dimitriou. And if you want to have a coaching session with Lisa, Linda, or me, just text me at 404-664-4340. If you have a question you want us to answer, or if you have a recommended resource or article you think we should discuss, just send it to questions@yourcollegeboundkid.com. Our favorite method is for you to record your own voice at speakpipe.com/YCBK. By the way, check out our website where you'll find lots of content that is not on any podcast app. Our website is yourcollegeboundkid.com. If you want to learn about other hot admissions topics, follow us on Twitter at YCBK Podcasts. We think of you as our listening family, and we look forward to meeting again with you every single Monday and Thursday.